A wife who does not bear a son is useless. My husband and in-laws forced me into a divorce, saying even being a woman had no value. Having my newborn daughter taken away, I had no choice but to comply with their demands. When I agreed to the divorce, my daughter and I were immediately thrown out of the house. Years later, having barely survived, my ex-husband appeared before me. "What, you're still alive? I bet you're groveling at your poor parents' home, living a miserable life, huh?" As usual, it seems all this man can do is put me down. "I remarried a daughter from a big farming family," he boasted. "My wife gave me a son, ensuring a secure future for our family. We are the winners, 100%. Aren't you jealous?" He laughed vulgarly. I asked him, which big farm family? He arrogantly shared the name and location of the farm, using his family as an example, telling me to climb up to their level if I could. Hearing the name and location of the farm, I remembered something. "Oh, that farm? Didn't you know? Actually, that farm's land is." After I revealed the truth, my ex-husband called me a delusional attention seeker. "Pathetic, a woman over 30, he ranted. Little did he know, a shocking fate awaited him and my former in-laws for discarding me like garbage. I am a married woman in my 30s. As the eldest of 3 sisters, I lived at home until I graduated from high school. I moved out to attend college for the convenience of commuting. After college, I started working and haven't returned home. In my mid-20s, through a friend's introduction, I met and married my husband. I told my parents about the man I wanted to marry, and we met. But my parents opposed our marriage. On the other hand, my husband also had reservations about my parents. He believed that as long as the parties involved agreed, there was no problem with getting married. So I went through with the marriage without reconciling with my parents or sisters. Since then, I have not been in contact with them. My poor parents and relatives, glad I don't have to deal with them." My ex-husband remarked. "You must be happy to have cut ties with your meddlesome parents too, right?" On the day I introduced my husband to my parents, my father arranged for us to meet in a private room at a traditional restaurant. My mother cherishes a handbag gifted by my father, carefully maintaining it and always carrying it for special occasions. It seems to be a sort of lucky charm for her. Before our meeting, she had even sent it off for repairs. However, my husband whispered to me that it looked poor. "That's an ugly bag. Its design is old-fashioned and reeks of the old era. I think it's more stylish to cherish and maintain what you love rather than being swayed by trends and discarding things after short use." However, my husband believed it was more important to follow the trends of the times. Due to this, I was glad to have lost contact with my parents and relatives, a sentiment my husband often expressed in the early days of our marriage. Shortly after our marriage, my husband moved into the apartment where I lived, starting our married life. However, within 6 months, we had to move in with his parents. My husband said it was important to save money for raising children, and I agreed. I got along well with my mother-in-law, so I thought living with my husband's family wouldn't be a problem. My husband's family has been employed by companies for generations, including his father and grandfather. His grandfather chose a public servant career, believing it to be the most stable. My father-in-law, unable to become a public servant, worked for a private company. My husband also worked for a company, albeit one less prestigious than where his father worked. The household income was lower than the average in the U.S., relying heavily on my father-in-law's salary, who was still working. Despite this, my in-laws strongly desired a male heir. A wife only proves her worth by giving birth to an heir for her in-laws. Make sure the first grandchild is a boy. thinking how outdated it was to require a male child as an heir. I felt strongly about this as I am a sister myself, believing in male superiority and that women are useless without a son. I had a bad feeling about my mother-in-law's views. Still, for almost a year into our marriage, my husband and I were drifting, relying on luck because I was still working. I thought if I could get pregnant by 30, that would be fine. But my mother-in-law thought differently. When are you planning to end your honeymoon phase? It's common sense to have children in your 20s. Who knows what disabilities a child born from an older mother could have? She claimed my working was preventing my husband from fully committing to starting a family. Then, without my knowledge, she submitted my resignation. Of course, I was shocked when my boss told me that my mother-in-law had submitted my resignation. But my boss quickly agreed, saying, "If you want children, it can't be helped." My boss believed that the greatest happiness and duty of a woman is to get married and raise children. He frequently made statements that could cause serious issues if heard by the concerned parties, such as unmarried women devoted to their careers lacking charm. Working under such a boss, I'd likely face pressure about when I was having children or to take early maternity leave because it's nice women can work just until they're ready to sit at home. Indeed, someone had already resigned due to his remarks. Despite my discomfort, I resigned to avoid conflict with my mother-in-law. She then demanded I take my basal body temperature and time my ovulation to ensure pregnancy. My efforts didn't align with her schemes. Are you sure you're doing your part? You're not using birth control, are you? My mother-in-law started to suspect that I didn't want to get pregnant and was intentionally avoiding it. I do want children. However, I do not insist on having a son as she does. Then, my father-in-law, who had been quiet until now, suggested that the problem might be with me. He mentioned he had heard that issues with not getting pregnant usually lie with the woman, and he urged me to get tested immediately. The results showed there was nothing wrong with my health. I suspected the problem might lie with my husband, but my father-in-law adamantly defended him, insisting a man could not be the issue, citing outdated beliefs that men have upheld America. I was made out to be the useless one, the bad actor in this. My family has always had sons born first. The wives who married into our family were all capable. It's a shame my son ended up with a mismatched wife. We went to a church known for blessings of fertility, where we prayed and participated in purification rituals. We bought charms and desperately hoped for a sign of pregnancy, but there was none. My in-laws meant well, but to me, it was nothing but pressure. I asked my husband to let nature take its course and give it more time, but he wouldn't listen. 2 years of marriage and no child? It's a disgrace, almost as if my husband is infertile, they despaired. Instead of understanding, he pressured me even more, telling me to try harder for his sake. As there were no signs of pregnancy, our relationship began to deteriorate. He started coming home late, and every weekend he returned drunk, reducing our attempts to conceive. Honestly, I was relieved. Being physically intimate with my husband out of obligation on weekends and ovulation days was exhausting. His late returns also meant less blaming from my in-laws, which calmed my mind. One day, my husband came home in a good mood after a long time and initiated intimacy. Weeks after our rare encounter, feeling unwell, I visited a doctor and discovered I was finally pregnant. I returned to my in-laws' house, light-footed with the news. It was a pregnancy at the edge of my 20s, after 4 years of marriage. With the pregnancy confirmed, my mother-in-law's attitude changed drastically. She became incredibly kind, and my household chores were significantly reduced. It was a pampered and careful 9 months. When it was time to find out the baby's sex, my in-laws hadn't asked me to check. So I looked forward to the surprise at birth. They believed I would have a boy based on my strong features. However, when the time came, I gave birth to a girl. My in-laws had opposed having my husband in the delivery room, believing men shouldn't attend births, so his presence was not there. I wished he could have been by my side, but faced with his parents' opposition, he seemed almost relieved. The meticulous care from my mother-in-law during pregnancy meant I suffered less from pregnancy symptoms than expected. As my belly grew, walking and shopping alone became difficult, and I asked my husband to drive me, which he did, but he never helped carry the groceries. It seemed as if he thought his duty ended with planting the seed. I sensed that raising our child would be a challenging endeavor. And so, my husband and in-laws waited outside the delivery room, anxious for the news. The birth was not only delayed but also difficult, and I felt very vulnerable. I worried I might not hear my baby's cry, but when I did, the baby's sex didn't matter anymore. "Thank you for being born healthy," was all I could think. Yet, when the nurse announced, "It's a healthy baby girl," my in-laws exploded beside my exhausted self. I didn't want a granddaughter. Girls are just a burden. Eventually going to another man's house. A useless wife. Do you want to end our family line? Do you have a grudge against our family finances? Do you want to shame my son as the man who couldn't produce a successor? My ex-husband chimed in. Their noisy complaints filled my ears. Don't they understand childbirth is a life-risking effort? I thought, too tired to respond. All I wanted was to be left to sleep. Yet, my father-in-law claimed that because I came from a family of 3 sisters, I was destined to only produce girls. He accused me of deceiving them with my female-only lineage. From now on, don't think of yourself as a wife. Work like a servant, you don't need maternity leave, he said as he dragged me out of bed. Stopped by a nurse who heard the commotion, he threw out a parting shot. "You only get today to rest," and left the room. My mother-in-law and husband followed him out, despite the impossibility of discharging the day after birth. When I was finally allowed to leave the hospital and return to my in-laws' house, my belongings had been removed from my room. "A servant doesn't need a room, just curl up in a corner," my father-in-law declared. I rented a storage unit for my belongings, hoping that by doing housework and raising my child flawlessly, my in-laws would eventually understand. Staying in a corner of the room didn't bother me, but it was difficult with a newborn daughter. I begged my in-laws to at least let her sleep inside the room. They agreed to lend the space by the hour. I had some savings from my single years, so I decided to pay for the room time. However, they demanded additional fees for the baby's crying and the inconvenience of disposable diapers. My daughter often cried at the sound of my in-laws shouting, and they grew increasingly irritable, calling her charmless. I became unsure how to reconcile. Without anyone to consult and rarely leaving the house due to housework and childcare, I felt isolated. Then, one day, my husband's affair came to light, orchestrated by my in-laws. Unusually, my mother-in-law suggested that my daughter and I should go for a walk in the park. If I had been calm, I might have suspected something was amiss. However, worn out as I was, I took her suggestion and relaxed in the park, eager for a change of scenery. While we were out, my mother-in-law called, claiming an emergency with my husband and asked us to return. When I arrived, I found him laughing with an unknown woman and my in-laws eating luxury meal. "You couldn't get pregnant easily." So I introduced him to a girl who seems like she could pop out kids easily. She had casually mentioned my struggles to a friend, leading to a conversation about setting up my husband with her daughter. They hit it off, and my in-laws intensified their criticism and nitpicking to drive me out, especially after finding out I was pregnant. But they continued the relationship, thinking if a son was born, all would be well. If not, they had a backup plan. The child born is a girl and useless. Since I had not given birth to a son, I was deemed useless. And they concocted various schemes to drive me out. Instead of running away, I endured and persevered. So reluctantly, they forced a divorce with his affair partner present. I want to divorce you. Your presence worsens my parents' mood, and it makes our home tense, doesn't it? As I stood dumbfounded by his selfish words, my father-in-law snatched my daughter from my arms. He threatened to throw her into the yard if I didn't sign the divorce papers, making a throwing gesture. I screamed with all my might to stop him. I think it was the loudest I've ever yelled in my life. With no other options, I silently signed the divorce papers. My ex-husband tossed a thin bank envelope at my feet, calling it severance pay. As I picked them up, my husband and in-laws sneered and laughed mockingly. I endured the humiliation and bitterness. I bit my lips so hard that I tasted blood in my mouth. My husband's affair partner seemed unfazed by the situation, even appearing smug. With nowhere to go, I had no choice but to turn to my estranged parents. I could have managed alone, but with a newborn daughter, it felt daunting to go on by myself. I had almost nothing to start with. They kept finding reasons to charge me extra fees. My husband refused to contribute financially to our daughter's expenses, telling me to figure it out myself if I wanted to raise her. I contacted my parents, asking if they could at least take in my daughter. When they asked where I was, they told me not to move from there. Shortly after, my father arrived, driving with my mother in the passenger seat. My father drove, my mother sat next to him, and my daughter and I were in the back seat. I began to share everything that had happened since my marriage. While I spoke, my parents listened silently without uttering a single word. The last thing I said was an apology for not even telling them about my daughter's birth, asking if they could at least take her in. Then my mother said, "It must have been hard, you did well." My father bluntly told me to come back home. When we returned home, my sisters were still there. And my old room was just as I had left it after high school graduation. My father told me I could use that room as I liked. From the room preserved as I had left it, I deeply felt my parents' love. The floors and shelves were clean, and the blanket smelled faintly of the sun. My mother had been maintaining it for 12 years, ensuring I wouldn't be inconvenienced whenever I returned. I sensed my father's deep affection in his few words. Reflecting on it, I realized that my father, who had never opposed my decisions, had clearly said, "Not that man," when it came to my marriage. I asked why he had opposed it. I thought they might have conducted a background check without my knowledge. But that wasn't it. My mother said she didn't like speaking ill of others, but if she had to say something, it was because she thought he only looked at the surface. I remembered that during our initial meeting, my ex-husband had been overly concerned about my mother's handbag. He said those with good bags are wealthy, and those who care for old bags for a long time are poor. I regretted not listening to my parents' reasons for opposition and rashly cutting ties to marry. I apologized to my parents for acting selfishly and making a poor decision. 3 years have passed since I divorced and returned to my parents' home. Even though my parents welcomed me back, I cannot rely on them forever as a mother. These 3 years have been the most intense of my life. One day, I ran into my ex-husband, who was doing agricultural work locally. He looked very different from the man I knew. His skin was sunburnt and rough from lack of care. The man I had married had thought wearing nice things was a status symbol and, regardless of his personality, always took care in his appearance. Seeing him in ragged, dirty work clothes seemed almost surreal. He explained that his mother-in-law had instructed him to help out at his affair partner's family farm. My wife's family owns a large farm. She gave birth to a boy first, securing our family's future. I thought he would stop at bragging, but he then insulted me. You went back to your poor family, right? A divorced woman in her 30s with a kid, and your unmarried sisters must be quite the burden. Did you have to grovel to your miserly parents? How did that feel? He asked rudely. It's fine if he speaks ill of me. Getting upset over such a despicable man's words would be a waste of time and effort. But I couldn't forgive him for speaking ill of my parents and sisters, who had warmly welcomed me back. I knew of the farm he mentioned. I asked him, which farm is that? He claimed it was the largest landholder in the area. Unknown to him, my family had historically leased land for profit. Going back through my father's family tree, it seems we had an influential ancestor who managed this area. This ancestor lived frugally, aligned with the villagers. And my father's family had continued to live modestly according to that tradition. That's why our family home is just a normal, old two-story house. Since returning home, I've been helping my father with his business while raising my daughter. I discovered that the parents of my ex-husband's affair partner were involved in my father's business. I told my ex-husband that the farm was actually leasing land from my parents. He exploded, accusing me of lying. Your mother has only an old bag, and her clothes at the greeting were outdated. You must be poor if you can't afford new clothes for your daughter's departure, he ranted in panic. I told him I wasn't idle enough to come to the agricultural cooperative just to lie. I was there for my family's rental business. Our family owns not just farmland but also apartments and buildings. A well-known company's branch is in one of our buildings. A real estate magnate known to anyone living in the area for a long time. Initially, my younger sister was set to take over the family business when I got married. But during the 4 years I was married, she found her own path. That's when I returned. Having always been interested in my father's work, I decided to take over after him. My middle sister is now pursuing her dreams, working hard after moving out. As I explained this, my ex-husband still didn't believe me, calling it lies and fantasies. If you're going to say that, how about this? I remarried an old friend, I told him. When I showed my wedding ring, my ex-husband's face contorted. I don't mean to brag, but my current husband treats my daughter from a previous relationship as his own. The apartment on the land my father let me manage on a trial basis became popular quickly. After my husband and I added our ideas. It was an old apartment with many vacancies and considered out of date. But now it's popular among young couples and considered ideal for raising children. My ex-husband, unaware of such a change, confronted me aggressively. You tricked me. Acting all poor. No, you're the one who assumed I was poor. Let go. I tried to push his hand away, but he only gripped harder. He even pulled my hair, which prompted someone who noticed the commotion to call for security. A few men tried to help me, but my ex-husband resisted fiercely, even biting them. A burly security guard appeared, and my ex-husband hesitated for a moment, which was enough for him to be subdued and taken outside. Later, my ex-husband contacted me. Thinking it was an apology for his previous behavior, I answered the phone. But he was actually begging for money. He explained that his mother-in-law had fallen victim to a termite scam and had been swindled out of a significant amount of money, causing financial hardship. They tried to borrow money using their family home as collateral. But his father-in-law had retired early after passing on the family leadership to him because a successor was born. It seems he was also swindled out of his retirement funds. My ex-husband couldn't cover the expenses for 2 households on his income alone. And, too proud to admit his financial incapacity, he embezzled company funds and got caught, resulting in his dismissal. Not only was he fired, but he was also required to repay the full amount he embezzled. The parents of his affair partner ended up covering for him. My ex-husband and his parents lost everything, and were working off their debt at the affair partner's family farm. Even though they worked, their wages were seized to repay the debt, leaving them physically and mentally devastated. He said it was a living hell, with their marrow being sucked dry. He begged my parents to pay off his remaining debt. Please save us from this hardship. You're our only hope. Which right do you have to say that? I clenched my fist tightly to control my anger. My nails dug into my palm, causing pain. It felt like the pain in my hand was keeping my rage in check. Even when I begged for help, you cared only about your public image and didn't help. I don't think there's any value in helping people who judge others only by their appearances. I firmly declined his request, thinking it was a good opportunity for him to understand what it feels like to be oppressed. I also told him not to contact me anymore, since I didn't expect him to take it seriously. I blocked his number on my smartphone and home phone. Then he started lurking around the agricultural cooperative and even ambushed me. Security personnel, recognizing him, chased him away. But since he vaguely remembered where my parents' house was, he also lay in wait there. He hid when my parents or husband were around but confronted me alone, threatening to keep following me until I gave him money. This behavior eventually became known at the cooperative, and my parents heard about it, suggesting I file a police report. However, I preferred to avoid involving the police, as anyone in business might understand. I wanted to settle things amicably, without holding any grudges, even against those at fault. It may be true that I'm looked down upon because of that. However, as a person, I would prefer to live without conflict. Then, my parents lodged a complaint with the parents of the daughter from the farming family who had taken my ex-husband from me. My parents told them, "Your son-in-law is our daughter's ex-husband, and your daughter took him from our daughter. Now he is begging our daughter for money. His lurking and following her around is causing a great nuisance. I hear that bad rumors about him have spread around the agricultural cooperative. Please take responsibility and handle this," they said quite sternly. Upon learning the truth, the affair partner's parents apologized, admitting they had done something terrible without knowing I was the daughter of a landowner. Later, the daughter who had been the affair partner came to apologize to me, accompanied by her parents. She expressed shame for having believed, and sided with my ex-mother-in-law's suggestions to drive me out. I told her that words are easy to say, so if she truly felt sorry, I asked her to strictly discipline my ex-husband and ensure he does not contact me unless it's work-related. I also asked her to ensure that he does not involve himself with me outside of work. Although we're currently connected through our parents, I knew we would eventually have to interact in our generation. I didn't want a casual relationship. I wanted a clear separation, strictly for work purposes. Later, I heard that the affair partner's parents severely reprimanded my ex-husband, even confiscating his room, similar to what he had done to me. He was now living crammed with his parents-in-law in a corner of a tool shed. Eventually, my ex-mother-in-law was ostracized by the parents of the affair partner, after being caught secretly harvesting and selling crops. She blamed their hunger on them, which led to further discord. Unwilling to forgive the debt, they decided to loan her out to a known, quirky old couple who hated dishonesty. The old couple re-educated her quite harshly after learning what she had done. Thanks to that, I heard she had become as thin as a skeleton. When I go to the cooperative, I hear various rumors, but eventually, I stopped hearing about my ex-husband and his family. It seems the parents of the affair partner renewed their lease on the land. So they likely continued farming. The fact that I no longer hear rumors about my ex-husband suggests they are keeping their promise to supervise him strictly. The following year after this ordeal, I became pregnant with my current husband. We had a son, but I vowed not to raise him with the expectation that a son must take over everything. My husband shows equal love and care to both our daughter and son. My daughter seems to have matured a bit, taking on the role of an older sister. With support from my parents, my son is growing up in a nurturing environment. My middle sister is still pursuing her dreams and seldom visits home. My youngest sister recently met someone nice and started talking about marriage. My parents are still far from retirement, continuing to work diligently. We live fully in the present, feeling that our happiness depends on our efforts. I want to live without forgetting this feeling.